And hopefully this microphone should be working now. I think there we go, so we can all be heard. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yes, great. Gentlemen, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
Great to see you here. And Peter, again, thank you for kicking off that discussion. I think we should probably start with that, shouldn't we? Because I suspect there might be very different definitions of this thing called ethical data stewardship, or as you suggested, Peter, more even answers than questions and definitions at this stage. Rob, would you like to start with that? I mean, what does it mean to you, and what does it mean to Facebook?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons why ethics is important, and this was sort of a thread throughout your talk, Peter, is the idea of trust. Right? You know, if we think about Facebook as an organization that is trying to give people the power to build communities and come closer together, an inherent part of that is an assumption that people trust Facebook to be good stewards of their data. That when they put their information on Facebook, then Facebook is going to hold it in a trustworthy way. And then more than that, and I think this is sort of where a lot of us have been going as we've been thinking about the idea of data ethics, is as we develop new ways to use data, as we develop new technologies, and you talked about some of them that can have potential benefits for society, making sure that we are continuing to be trustworthy in the way that we handle that. And I think, you know, one of the things that often comes up when we think about this is sort of where does privacy compliance and ethical responsibility begin? Are they the same thing? Are they different? And you know, for me, I think one of the benefits of having an ethical framework and thinking about data ethically is the idea that, you know, we're never, if the premise is that we're building new ways to use data and new ways to use technology in positive ways, we're never going to be able to write down a list of all of the considerations that we have to take into account. And so thinking about things ethically, understanding, you know, what is the broader impact that what we're doing has on society, and making sure that we have a positive impact rather than a negative one is a core part of what I think we're trying to accomplish.
Just before we move on to everybody else, I guess you need to then, don't you, be honest and drill down into that key question of why you want to use the data.
No, I think that's right, and I mean, I think, you know, when we think about ethics, and, you know, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the specific process that we have at Facebook. But when we think about it, one of the specific questions, actually, the first question that we ask is why. Right. So, you know, we have a cross-functional group, a sort of a review group within Facebook that thinks about these things. And the first question that we ask is, like, what's the benefit? Like, what's the point, both for Facebook in terms of, you know, the service that we're providing, but also for our community more broadly, right? So what we want to understand is this thing that we're doing something that creates value for the community that we're serving? And I mean that both in a negative sense and in a positive sense. So in the negative sense, it means, you know, we shouldn't be using data just to use it, or because we're interested, or, you know, these kinds of things. We should be doing it for an affirmative benefit. We should be doing it because there is value that we can create. But on the positive side, you know, one of the things, and you sort of opened your talk with this, you know, that failing to use data can also be a problem. And so one of the things that we want to make sure of is, as we're building technology and as we have the ability to do good with data, that we're identifying the opportunities to do that.
Okay, Simon?
So I agree with much of what Rob said, but I also think there's some additional things that are being missed in the conversation, which are implied by some of what Peter said. Trust is important, and the way you build and maintain trust is by being clear about what you stand for and then acting consistently with that. But it's actually, in many ways, the wrong question. What happens when trust declines? People compensate always by increasing other ways of, if you like, regulatory burden or transparency mechanisms and things like that. The bigger question, which comes from what Peter was implying, is around the question of legitimacy. Because when you lose legitimacy, no one will deal with you at any cost. And that brings you then into questions of this kind. Firstly, issues of purpose, and in your model that you developed, that's one of the first elements that I think is very important. It goes to the question that Rob was talking about.
It's the why question.
Yeah, it's the why, but also once you start to think seriously about questions of purpose, then you've got to ask yourself a couple of different things. Firstly, what is a good form of this thing? What makes it fit for the defined purpose you've got? Yeah. But also, you've got to ensure that you use the appropriate means in order to secure the end that you are aiming for. And it's a basic truism that when technical mastery is divorced from ethical restraint, you get tyranny, you get bad outcomes, all sorts of things. And this is one of the big challenges as to how you actually ensure that ethical account. So the last point I'll make is I think I entirely agree that the old model of compliance, in which regulators sought to specify very prescriptive rules, against all expectations, has actually decreased the capacity for sound ethical judgment in this and in other areas where it's been done. Because when you create a compliance model, you start to create it in a way in which you sort of aim is so that no one can choose to do anything wrong. But inadvertently what you do is you create a world in which no one can choose to do anything right either.
Yeah.
You just comply, you tick the box. And ethical decision making, where you've got a clearly articulated set of core values and principles, such as you were talking about, it requires you to practice it. Like the world's best tennis player will lose their stroke if they don't practice. And we've created all sorts of compliance systems in which people no longer practice responsible decision making. So there's a clue for the regulators in this. APRA, which is the Prudential regulator for banks in this country, under its risk culture standard, it said something really innovative to the boards of banks. It said, we're not going to tell you what kind of culture you must have. We're not going to tell you what values and principles you must have, but we are going to insist that you as a board must be able to name these things, you must be able to measure them, and you must be able to tell us how you're closing any gaps between those things. And then they left it. So there's a kind of this interplay between regulatory certainty and the responsibility you look for from corporations.
Peter, is that what you were getting to when you were talking about the regulatory compliance versus trusting organisations?
Yeah, I think that if you look at a future view of this, let's imagine a regulatory investigation that comes in and the regulator says, I might disagree with your outcome, but I can find no fault in your process. And that's a really interesting thing, because now we think about kind of unbundling that a little bit. One of the challenges, the differences that we're wrestling with is, in GDPR language, a balancing process for legitimate interests or a data privacy impact assessment still ends up with the question, it depends, which is what Simon's saying. You need to have some ability inside your organizations to evaluate, well, is that really beneficial for both the company and for the organization or not, which is a very different model than saying, yes, I got consent.
Tick, tick,
yes,
tick, tick.
Which is the more important part?
Absolutely
the process, the outcome? The process they've gone through or the outcome?
Well, I think the process, in some respects, done right, is more important than the outcome. Because I think reasonable minds are going to disagree with the outcome.
Yeah.
But if you can, an organization, I think about an ethical decision-making framework as a describable justification as to how you made a decision. To unpack that's describable justification.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, I think part of the point here is, you know, the things that we're talking about, you're never going to be able to write a list and say, here are all of the ethical judgments one might have to make. Here are all the factual situations that you're going to have to consider.
I'm going to let you finish, but I think Simon might have a different view. But just hold that thought, Simon. I mean, I'm wondering if maybe you actually think they are listable and describable, but go on.
I mean, I think, you know, I mean, we talked about values, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Simon's point is, you know, different organizations are going to have different values. They're going to articulate them differently. They need to be articulatable. But then if you don't know ahead of time all of the situations that you're going to confront, I think, you know, having a framework and having an ability to make that judgment is important. Having a process and making sure, and I think, you know, the people in the room who think about privacy think about this concept of privacy by design, making those judgments early on in the process rather than after everything is done and then you just sort of check a box. And I think those pieces are important. Obviously, the outcome matters, though.
Well, the outcome
right,
does
like
matter.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but the outcome does matter, but it's not the only consideration. And I agree with you on this. I mean, most people, when you say, what should we do, a lot of people are interested in the outcome, but people are equally interested in, are we bound by certain duties? I mean, the Commissioner's opening comment about this being a rights-based approach is something which comes before any outcome. You recognise these intrinsic rights that come from human beings, and the way this data not merely is about you, but it is of you in some ways as well. Look, the strength of what Peter put up is that in any ethical framework you need values and principles. They do different jobs. You need to be able to have a process by which you are making those so clear to your user community, to your employees, to anyone, that they can make a rational choice about whether to engage with you or not. And there can be an ecology on this in which people have different values and principles, and you need to be able to have a process which does begin with the facts in each case, but is always able to give an accounting of the reasoning behind it. Now, people may disagree, but if you have patently just preferred self-interest and rationalised that in something, that should be transparent. And you can unpick this. Anybody who's got any experience in this can take that apart and see, look, that's just a stitch-up rather than being a genuine set of argument. But within that, there will be room for disagreement, and that's the basis on which the debate goes forward.
I think that's a really interesting line that we should go down, but I want to remind you that this is a conversation that includes you. Whack your hand up, any observation, question, contribution you'd like to make, I'll call on you. Let's get a microphone here, first of all. A lady in black over here. Whack your hand up again so we can see. And then, sir, I'll come to you next. Can I just ask you one thing, though? Keep your questions and observations on point with where we are. You know the nature of this conversation, where we're going, and I'm sure we'll get to the areas that we're after. And if we haven't, then right at the end, we can have those questions that don't relate to this conversation point where we are. Go right ahead. Can you introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sally Bradley. I'm from AGL Energy. I think you're talking, Simon, about outcomes, and I think part of the question that you need to go into with this is, what about the unintended outcomes? Because I think all good intentions are great, but if there's still an unintended outcome, that's really where the problems start to arise.
So maybe the process wasn't correct in the first place if you've got that unintended outcome, you mean?
Well, I think it's more about you have an intended...
Hold it up nice and close, yeah.
Sorry. You have an intended approach and with an objective, but, and particularly in terms of privacy, you're looking towards the greater good, basically, and what you're trying to achieve with your approach.
But not at any cost. And I think a good ethical decision-making process, it has a number of core components to it, which I won't go through now. But one of the things it will do is, if it's well executed, it will do as good a job as you can reasonably expect of anticipating the unintended outcomes by being clear about dimensions to a problem which are not necessarily confined just to securing a particular end. And a little bit of moral imagination, a little bit of careful consideration of stakeholders. Yeah, this can go a very long way in being able to do that.
Can you expand on that, moral imagination?
Well, it's to do with the ability to place yourself in the shoes of others. We were talking before about an example, Target. This is an infamous one that everybody in the room will probably know. In the US, Target developed an algorithm by which they were able to make a statistical analysis of the data to predict with, I think, an 86% accuracy rate whether or not a person was pregnant or not. And so on the basis of that, they send a brochure to a house. A man turns up, sees it's addressed to his young teenage daughter and says, "This is outrageous. How can Target be sending things about pregnancy to a child of this age?" Goes and attacks the store, and they apologise. He comes home and he says to his daughter, "I've been there, it's outrageous." And she says, "But Dad, I'm pregnant." Now, she was completely denied the right to tell her parents about her particular situation in her own time. But that was something that you can imagine. A moral imagination puts you into the shoes of other people, the different cases that might arise. And Target was justly held culpable for its lack of consideration in a case like that. Now, we could probably think of a million other cases like that, but that's the sort of thing that gets you into that space.
Well, it's such a great example on a number of different levels. One, we might all imagine that perhaps there was a process breakdown in Target, because one could imagine...
Well, they didn't think about it. That's the problem.
Potentially. The challenge for organizations is the same algorithm that produces, a pregnancy indicator also produces you're likely to buy a lawnmower. So it's not a distinct algorithm. So you might imagine that a process that was working right would say, well, hang on a sec.
They're not the same thing.
No, but what they should have said, look, see, Rob's made it such an important point, is that we have a benefit to respect individuals, but part of that respect is making sure they get the benefit of the data. So I can tell you from first-hand knowledge that one of the complaints that Target gets most about offers that they send to other people is complaints, why didn't I get the same offer? And so you can see that for a number of people, that discount on something pregnancy-related would be an extremely beneficial value added. So you might imagine a process that would have said, well, wait a sec, why don't we capitalize on the benefits for our users, but quite frankly, not send it to people that we know are under the age of 18. Yeah. It might have been an interesting process.
Yeah, so it's a variable. It's a variable that you add into the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that may be useful here is to dig a little bit, like one level deeper on what we mean when we're talking about about an ethics program or an ethical assessment, because it's not just, hey, I want to show ads to people based on, or send offers to people based on the products that they've bought in the past. So that seems ethical. Let's do it, right? If it's just that, that's probably not what we're talking about here. And so, I mean, I think it's worth, just talking about what are the kinds of things that should go into that. And to your point, they should be considered expressly so that after the fact you can look back and understand how the decision was reached. But I mean, to me, one thing that we haven't talked about is this stuff has to start before there's an idea to show ads to people based on their buying history or whatever it is, right? So you have to train the people and instill in them an understanding that privacy and ethics are important values of the organization. You have to help them understand why that's so and what the organization believes. But then in individual cases, you have to think about a number of different things. And I suspect if we sort of if we were to crowdsource what the considerations are, we'd each have slightly different ones. But I mean, thinking about, I think the point that Virginia raised earlier about what are you doing and why? What is the benefit here? What's the outcome? And who does it benefit, right? So that's a thing that you need to think about.
But you also have to build in, Rob, more generally within an organisation, an alignment with its other systems, policies and structures. So you've seen in financial services here, organisations which have talked very importantly about the appropriate selling of the right product to the right person. Mm-hmm. But when it came to remuneration, the only thing they would measure was volume of sales. And the message they send there is, we don't care how you sell it,
right?
As long as you do well.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly have to.
So it's more than just this particular issue. It's an organisation-wide approach to this as a serious thing, which is then not counterbanded by other systems and policies that are put in the organisation.
I'm going to get a microphone up the front here because I've got a question. The gentleman in the check shirt. I hope that conversation about moral imagination has taken you at least to think about unintended consequences and how to avoid. Before we get to your question though, just something we were getting to and I wanted to follow up, and Simon, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but what you were suggesting before we got to that question, talking about the stitch-up and the sort of the fig leaf, if you like, of the ethical data stewardship. And it gets back to my original question around why is there are going to be, and there clearly are, and sitting on this stage we have a representation of a commercial need to use data. There needs to be a degree of honesty about that, doesn't there? And that there will inevitably, at some point, be some clash there. And it seems to me, particularly when it comes to Facebook, that I'm not going to be impressed by some sort of, ethical framework or standpoint that doesn't acknowledge the fact that you're there to make money.
That's right. And I mean, I think, part of an ethical assessment is also understanding what people's expectations are and understanding whether the organization is being transparent.
And you need to be honest with me that you're going to be using that data to make money, and it's money from my information.
Right. I mean, I think advertisers are paying Facebook to deliver ads to the right people, and I mean, this is sort of, we hear the same thing that you were talking about, that what people, the main complaint that people have about advertising on Facebook is when it's not relevant enough, when it's not showing them.
Really,
things
that's
that
the main
actually,
complaint.
Yeah, I mean that's actually sort of the primary thing that we hear when we talk, which is different from sort of what I think about as a person who thinks about privacy. But,
yes, I'm surprised by that.
But I think the interesting thing is, right, people need to understand, one, that Facebook is an advertising-supported service, what that means, how we're using information as a part of that, and particularly why they're seeing the specific ads that they're seeing. So one of the things that you can do on Facebook, which I think I don't want to say that it's unprecedented, but certainly uncommon, is when you're seeing an advertisement on Facebook, we will tell you why you're seeing that particular advertisement, and then you can dig deeper to understand what other interests are used to show you ads, why we think that you have that, and why we think you have those interests. And that's important, not just because it's a good experience and it's important for people to know, but it deals with the point that you're raising, that we need to be candid with people about how we're using their information and why we think it has value, not just for us as a business, but for the service that we're providing.
There's nothing wrong with a business being clear that one of its values is around profitability.
But that's what I'm
and
saying.
Success.
It's just the clarity of that.
That's right, and they should be transparent if that's one of the things that's driving the business. And there's no necessary incompatibility between that and delivering a good which is broader than just for the company, which is the point that you were making, that you can actually use the data in ways which are going to be a net good for the individual and for the wider society.
Did you want to jump in here, Peter, on that?
Well, I think why this is a kind of it's interesting to kind of test these models and develop it in something that has now become so, quite frankly, common, like online advertising. But if we think why this is important is we need to kind of entrench these sorts of decision-making processes, beneficial type risk type assessments, because we're fast heading into a world where many of the decisions that all of the things we depend on are going to be made by machine learning or artificial intelligence. Yeah. And so if we don't solve this decision-making framework now, I'm not sure how it's going to be solvable in a way when it's even less transparent.
It is in principle unsolvable in some cases.
Yes.
That's one of the problems about machine systems. There are some we all know these ethical issues. To take a simple domestic example, someone you love comes home with a new outfit or haircut and says, darling, what do I look like? On the one hand, you may have 10 units of compassion versus 10 units of truth in circumstances where you know if you tell them the truth, you're going to hurt them. The answer when the 10 in this way is null. And machine intelligence can't handle the null, and yet we have to.
So, right, I mean, but I think this may be a thing that we add to our list of, what are the things that we need to consider in an ethical assessment? Because, on the one hand, we've made a judgment, to take, an example that's probably familiar to a lot of people in the room when you're thinking about machine learning and its impact on something like discrimination. We've made a judgment as a society or a collection of societies that says it's not okay to deny somebody insurance because of their ethnicity, for example, right? And so, understanding that technology can do that, we need to also apply social judgments and say there are certain things that even though technology is capable of it, we've decided are not okay, and then we need to build into our process a step where we say, let's look at the system that we've designed and make sure it's not doing these things that we don't want.
And there are limits to what machines do.
Just quickly, Simon, I want to get to a question.
Yeah, the tough decisions, as we all know, are not the right versus wrong, good versus bad. It's right versus right. It's good versus good. It's when you're being pulled. And that's something which humans uniquely have to contend with.
Go right ahead. This does fit. Don't touch it. They'll do it at that end.
Okay. This does fit in, I think, because I was thinking your ethical framework, public versus private sector, where in the public sector, you're forced to deal with the government, so you can't vote with your feet. Facebook, and the other thing is, I guess your ethical framework, is it different in an online environment versus bricks and mortar? Because Facebook gets real-time information. If its customers ditch it, you get an ethical guidance from your customers in real time, but government doesn't tend to get that. And the people don't have a choice. So does the ethical framework have to differ, I guess, for public and private sector, and differ for online? Online, I think you can get more real-time information and feedback.
Peter, I'm going to get you to start with that, and then we'll go to Simon on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. What I think we're trying to solve for is a number of things. I kind of dumbed these down into a pretty simple equation. That trust equals being perceived that you're acting in my best interest, plus privacy, plus security. And I think if you think about kind of the way that we think about regulatory frameworks, they typically focus on maybe only one or two of those parts of the equation.
Just say that again. I think Rob's got a different view, but I just want you to say it again. So what's the equation again?
Trust equals being perceived as acting in the interests of the consumer or individual, plus privacy, plus security.
Rob?
I mean, I think those are pieces of it, but I mean, I think it almost goes to the broader point that there's a broader point that I think Virginia alluded to earlier, which is also just do I have an understanding of how this organization is making decisions? Like, do I feel like I know what's going to happen, how they're going to make decisions when I give them my data or when I choose to do business with them or whatever it is? I mean, I think there are a couple of components, but it all sort of ladders up to this broader, do I feel like I have confidence in the way this organization will behave?
And that comes to, those three things are important, maybe essential, but it's the larger question that you are what you say you are. You do what you say you'll do, and the consistency of that. Look, this is a very important question. We've got two worlds that sit together here. The world of the market is still defined by Adam Smith's idea that it's not through an enlightened benevolence that people act, but through self-interest, and that somehow the invisible hand will increase the stock of common good for us all. It's your world. The world of government, which you're connected with, is defined not by the pursuit of self-interest with the operation of the invisible hand, but by an absolutely conscious and consistent commitment to the public interest. And with that comes power. Ostensibly. That's well, yeah, sorry. Yeah, here I was off with the theories for a moment.
I'm no rube.
No, so these are the general, that's the idea.
Yeah.
So there is a difference. And then government has this kind of compulsive power as well, which further heightens its responsibility, because we cannot walk away from it. We can change them, but government's really this perpetual thing with its power to compel. And so I think there is going to have to be a special kind of discussion about what it does with that powerful position, which may be slightly different to that within the market. But the general ethical principles themselves will be the same if the ends are slightly different.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I think Simon's right bang on. I took a stab at writing what ethical principles or values-based would be, and because it was a blog, it was kind of designed to be vanilla, but I took a step back from it and said, this could apply in any circumstance, whether it be public or private or whatever organization.
Yeah.
They need to be adjusted to the organizational culture, language, experience, objective with their customers, but it's not a one size fits all.
There was a guy over there, Virginia. Who
No,
was
I've got.
Oh, right.
I'll do this.
Oh, sorry. just in case you hadn't seen him, that was all. He was.
She's got one job, just one. So I want the microphone just here to a lady wearing a scarf. Alison, if I can just get it over here. And can you whack your hand up? This bloke here. And then after that, we're going to... Anyone else while I'm looking? Yeah, and then after that, we're going to you, madam. Okay, so just in here. Thank you. And keep that microphone nice and close to your mouth if you can. Thanks.
Thank you. Michelle Pinero from IAG. I have a question.
Even closer.
I have a question for Rob from Facebook. You talked about a cross-functional group that make those ethical decisions. My question is about logistics and how often you have to get them together and the timeliness of getting those together with the insatiable appetite that I imagine Facebook has for the use of data.
So there are actually, I'm happy to talk in more detail. There's actually a lot of complexity to sort of the mechanics of how it works. But basically what we've done is we've tried to identify, recognizing sort of this moral imagination, although I've never heard that term before, this idea that having more people from more perspectives involved in decision making leads to better decision making because you can understand more contours of a problem. And so what we've tried to do is identify a group of people. We have a process that's led by the former head of the IRB at Stanford, but it includes legal experts, policy experts, security experts, people communications experts, and then experts with substantive knowledge in each of the areas where we're working. And the goal of that is to make sure that we're making judgments. And,
do you have any ethics experts?
We do, yes. including the
sorry,
person.
just on checks.
Yes, including the person who runs the process.
Simon's touting here.
Yes.
It's okay. You're not obliged.
He's going to pass me his resume.
Yes.
So, and one of the things that I think is really important in doing this well is recognizing it doesn't look the same every time, particularly in an organization like Facebook that moves very quickly. You can imagine that some of the judgments we make about the use of data are relatively benign, right? So, when we are changing the color of a button from light blue to slightly lighter blue or something like that, right? Like there's a thing that, has an implication, but it's a relatively mild implication relative to some of the other things that we've been discussing on this panel. And so one of the things that we have tried to do is to scale the process, and we actually put out a paper that describes how this works. But we scale the process so we identify the things that are likely to have broader ethical implications and put them through a heightened review process that goes through this cross-functional group of people, and in some cases goes through outside experts as well, depending on what the topic is.
So picking up on the question, how do you maintain, or how do you allow that process the time that it needs versus the commercial pressures that are coming in?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do is we actually do a lot of we do a lot of the assessment in an asynchronous way. That helps with documentation and understanding what the proposals are and how they're being made. And so we're able to have people look at a proposal and not all sit in a room and do it, and then we can have discussions that way. And then we bring people together for discussions when those are needed after they've looked at the initial proposal. So that's one thing that we do. I think one of the things that we also try to do is to establish these values up front and establish here's generally how we're going to think about these things. So it doesn't require, and to have a process that is implementable and that is scaled to the situation. So we're spending the time in the areas where it needs the most attention, not spending a lot of time on process where we think that we can move quickly because we've done this the button color thing, right? Where we've done that
you can have an ethical skid pad too, where you practice. Some people, when you're skidding towards a tree for the first time, counterintuitively, you might go to put your foot on the brake, which is the last thing you want to do. But if you're on a safe area where you're starting to test these particular things, you'll know that the better thing to do is to accelerate out of the corner. And you can take ethical issues, which you can game them, basically, and work through these processes and improve by doing so your capacity to make very quick decisions. So the first time you do it, it's slow, it's a bit cumbersome. then you get faster and faster and faster by engaging in this kind of practice.
Yeah, and I think the other point to be made here is, in Facebook we have tooling that enables us to do this, and we sort of to triage the right people are going to look at it at the right time. We're documenting the decision and those sorts of things. But the reality is, this thing that we're talking about is going to look very different in different organizations, right? So Facebook has a way that we've developed products and features, and we've built this to work within that. But a 3-person startup, which also needs to think about ethics, is going to have a process that looks very different.
Yeah, the companies that I work with do similar sorts of things to what Rob's describing, but they have an escalation process based on the call it a threshold. In other words, you don't want everything going to a so-called ethics review board, but you do want to have the bet the company or bet the brand type of things absolutely go potentially all the way up to the chief executive officer.
Yep. A question over here.
Hello, Malcolm Crompton from Information Integrity Solutions. The first thing I'd like to say, Peter, is thank you so much for lifting the quality of the discussion. That was really quite a remarkable speech. Thank you. I think we have 2 concepts happening here that haven't quite been mentioned yet. One of them is this is actually a process for risk management, that we are trying to manage down a series of risks. The other concept that Peter talked about really was basically benefit cost analysis. In his larger impact assessment process, he was trying to say, let's look at the good side of things as well as the downside side of things. So I want to come back to the more complete approach to managing a risk, which is to think about prevent bad things from happening, detect, find out if bad things are happening, and do something or respond if bad things happen. The whole discussion so far really has been just about the first of those 3, prevent. How do you bring in the rest of your process? Because I think it was Rob who said, when something happens, we have a review process, and if you've got a demonstrable, written down, thought through, ethical process, it helps you do that review. But I'm wondering if you can complete the set by taking us through how you apply your ethical framework to how you build an appropriate response mechanism, and thereby reduce the impact of risk, and thereby increase your risk appetite for sending pregnancy advertisements to the right people.
Thanks, Malcolm. Who would like
I'll
to
take
start?
that one. Yeah. It's such a great point, Malcolm, on a number of levels. One is I think that a core value or principle that we're going to evolve to is not just transparency, but an effective redress system. In other words, to expect, back to my kind of complexity model, to expect anybody reasonable, like even informed people to understand what's going on and to kind of make an informed decision, I think, is wrong. But to provide a redress system is going to be equally important. But Malcolm made a very important point about kind of this is a risk management, and there's 2 elements of this. One is that by definition, risks aren't avoided, they're just mitigated. Well, you can avoid it, you just won't get the benefit or incur the risk. So that's really not a desirable outcome. But I think the other super important thing to think about is most risk frameworks don't effectively contemplate the benefits. And it's one of the weaknesses in the GDPR is that it asks for most of the balancing to be looked at through the lens of risk to the individuals and not benefits. So we had some success, I mentioned, with the European regulatory community, a segment of them last week, by saying, golly gee whiz, if we are going to do that balancing, that risk assessment, it absolutely has to include some quantification of what the benefits are.
Can I ask you about that? This will be kind of a typical philosopher's extreme question, but we are so used as a society to thinking about cost-benefit analysis that if the goods outweigh the harms, then we'll do it, that we often fail to attend to the fact that there are some things that we shouldn't do irrespective of what the outcomes are. So, I mean, if I take this extreme example, I mean, no one would say if we're going to improve the lives of 100,000 people, we should torture a child to death. We'd say that's non-negotiable. We won't do that sort of thing. So in your work, have you got any non-negotiables, that things that must never be done or must always be done within that? I accept the kind of risk-benefit framework as part of it, but what are the non-negotiables you've got?
Well, yeah, some of them are pretty obvious. Don't kill people.
Are they? But have you made them explicit within your framework at all?
No, and part of the reason is if you think about kind of the U.S. where I live now, almost without exception, it is an extremely defined harms base. So all of those kind of extremes have already been defined. There's things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act that are results of that say that what you can't use or how to discriminate against people. So I think we're I don't think that's the big gap. I understand exactly what your point is.
The only reason why I think it might be
Yeah.
is that the sorts of constraints that you're talking about are external to the ethical framework itself. They're imposed by society through regulation, and therefore they're contingent in a sense. They could change. And I think a really strong ethical framework has got to have some components within it which it owns for itself as being, as I say, I'll put it in the language of non-negotiable, to provide the kind of platform. And I think that's where a lot of the trust and other things come from too.
You're actually reinforcing a point that we've kind of both made, is that if I'm an organisation, I would actually codify that by being prescriptive about the values that I have.
Yeah.
You know, we are not going to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
I want to hear from Rob on this as well. I mean, look, because we could go through the examples of, recent or not so recent breaches, if you like, of data privacy by Facebook, and some of them are quite celebrated and well known, the emotional contagion study, for example. How does Facebook go about dealing with exactly this? And I want to get back to the point about risk management, Malcolm, in terms of a ethical framework in a moment, because I actually think there's something different that we're doing here. We're sort of sitting above all that. But Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points, and this goes to risk management, is I agree with you that the concept of ethics is something separate and apart from a privacy impact assessment or compliance or whatever these things.
And the consequences thereof.
Right, exactly. So they're different, right? But to be successful, this has to be integrated within that broader construct.
Yeah,
so, for example, when we've made a decision to do something or not do something, whether that's because of ethics or because of legal compliance or because of some other, or because of business or some other reason, there needs to be, so at Facebook we have internal auditing and external auditing, and we have processes in place to identify whether we've actually followed through with the things that we've internally set out to do. And so there's a broader set of functions there. But the point is, we shouldn't be thinking about ethics as something that doesn't fall into that broader thing. And to your point, Virginia, when generally speaking, the process works well, and we have those situations. But when we have negative experiences, we also want to make sure that we've identified them, we've diagnosed them, and that we actually make process improvements based on them.
Simon, as the ethics expert on this panel today, is a risk management approach the right one to take when you're talking about an ethical approach?
It's one lens, and it depends how it's done. For example, I think, as I mentioned before, APRA's approach to risk is a much more holistic one than typically is seen. It's well beyond just mere compliance. But
brief digression, would it be worthwhile to people in the room at their leisure to go and look at that framework?
I mean, you can read about it. It's just an interesting model for a regulator to take, and others have been looking at it as well. It's quite advanced. I think what I was trying to get at a bit before is that Peter's notion, for example, around respect, the notion of the intrinsic dignity of the person, which is where Timothy's idea about rights ultimately emerges, is such a fundamental idea that you'd expect that to be expressed in something here, because this is why the whole conversation takes place. It's not just about we're trying to manage risk to our reputation or to our profits. I think there's something much deeper that I think society is starting to have to contend with, which if we don't get right, it will actually forestall many of the benefits, the broader social benefits. Yeah. See, technology could be a huge boon to humanity, but at the moment, if you get outside perhaps this room, there are many, many people in the Australian community, in America, around the world, who are saying, actually, it's going to take my job, it's going to invade my privacy, I don't trust the people in charge that they're going to regulate it properly, I don't trust the companies to do it, therefore we're going to stop it like the Luddites tried to do. And this time they've got a vote, which the Luddites didn't have. And so unless you get this right, all of the opportunity will be lost. And it's going to require more than just prudential risk management to convince people.
That's what Peter was saying about the ethical obligation of actually using and deploying that data correctly.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of where I was going too. I mean, I think I'd like to talk about this in part because it's an evolving area of thought for Facebook and how we've explored these things. I mean, historically, we have not taken an approach that is very forward-leaning on using data and technology that we have developed in other ways. And sort of, Virginia, your point before about sort of what's core to our business. We have, nonprofits have come to us and said, hey, Facebook, you have technology to be able to do X, and we think it would be really valuable to do that. And very often we haven't done that, in part because there hasn't historically been an ethical frame for doing that. We haven't felt that we knew how to do the privacy well. And so we have, we've turned down a lot of those requests that I think, could have been beneficial. And we've started to shift our approach approach on this. So a recent example that I think we announced a couple of weeks ago is disaster mapping, where we're working with the Red Cross, the World Food Program, UNICEF, to actually take aggregated data. So for example, when people are on Facebook, some of them choose to share their location with us. Some of them choose to check in safe. So if you're in a disaster zone, Facebook might say, do you want to tell your friends that they're safe? It turns out that people's locations and the percentage of people in a particular area who check in safe are really good indicators of where the disaster responders need to go. And what we heard from the disaster responders was the 48 hours after a disaster are this critical period where we actually don't have granular information. We know we need to go to a city, but we don't need to know that we need to go to this neighborhood where response is needed, and that's actually costing lives. And so, because we didn't, years ago, have the framework that we're talking about, we weren't able to do that. And I think we've just been able to do that because we've invested in privacy-preserving technology, and we've invested in a framework to think about the broader ethics of something like that.
Got a few questions in there to quickly get through. We've got one here. If I can get a microphone just here. Madam, can you put your hand up so we know who's you? Yes. Still Gary, and we're coming to you next. And then, was it you that I saw just then? Yep. Okay, so 1, 2 and 3. Go right ahead.
All right then, thank you. My name is Anne Cole. I'm from Raytheon Australia.
Nice and close, Anne.
Mine is just a general comment, and it seems to me as though there's a big focus on trust and building trust in this whole process of the ethical approach to data and what we do with the data. But the other word that goes, and you seem to have alluded to it, and there's an obligation, I feel there's a stronger sense of trust and respect. And you've got to that word almost, but not quite in everything you've talked about. Mm-hmm. And I think it needs to be stronger. It is an obligation as well. It's not just personal interest. And I think if you focus on the respect side with the trust, it gives it a greater clarity and a greater direction. And I think it's just...
And I'm going to get Peter to comment on that first. Is that a term, a word, a concept that's popped up in the models that you've looked at and engaged with?
Absolutely. But if you can unbundle this just a bit, I think your point about trust and respect in terms of the individual user, customer, is absolutely pivotal. But where I think we've got to get to is the trust that their organization is doing the right things from a regulator standpoint. In other words, the regulators are really in my view, playing a backstop to all of this system, and the system is changing so quickly. And so I think Timothy really alluded to it in his comments about, which I'm going to paraphrase, saying that one path forward is binding codes of conduct. Well, what are codes of conduct? They're a description of the way that an organization is going to behave in some level of detail. Well, now we get to a describable framework as part of that code of conduct. Now we're starting to build trusted systems where a regulator can actually feel trust that the organization is doing what they're intending to do.
Thanks for that, Anne. The word respect in ethics has a very particular meaning. It's a foundational concept. And it's the word, its full form is respect for persons, and it's a recognition of the intrinsic dignity of every person, which is that irrespective of their race, colour, creed, what they do, they are of value in and of themselves, which means they can never be used simply as a tool for some other purpose. That's why slavery is the most blatant violation of that. So if you take this into the data world and you start to see your population of people who are providing information about themselves as just commodities to be bundled together and then exploited for some other purpose, then you've crossed one of these ethical Rubicons, if you like. So you're absolutely right about that it should be stressed, but we also need to understand respect has such a deep meaning that it's not just that you have to be respectful and considerate of people, it's that you cannot use them as a tool. And that's one of the challenges when data gets there, because it becomes anonymous and people start to disconnect bits and say, oh, it's just an aspect of the world.
Did you want to quickly jump in or we go to our next question? Yep, okay. Still Gary, go right ahead.
Thanks, Virginia. Flipping this ahead, 10 years, 20 years, we don't know how re-identification will work. We don't know how data can be used now. I think Facebook's one of the leading organisations on this, and I think it'd be fair to say even Facebook doesn't know what will be possible in 5 years' time. How do we work within that ocean of future possibilities, and at the same time when data can be bought, sold, stolen, leaked, etc.?
Leaked, yes. And that takes us to the story of the day. And good morning, Australian Tax Office. Do you have to have some sort of flexible framework that you can visit and revisit? Is that the way?
I mean, look, I think I think you're exactly right in pointing to this as the big challenge, not just for us in this discussion, but for all of us in the room, right? We don't know 20 years down the road what technology is going to look like, and you know, I mean, I think, you know, some of the speakers earlier today have alluded to this, you know, that technology has changed so much, right? If you would have thought about, you know, before the iPhone was invented, what mobile technology would look like in 2017, much less virtual reality or whatever the next thing is, we would have all had a prediction about what that would look like, and we would have all been wrong. And so one part of this is not to be prescriptive and to say, you know, with this particular technology, like when you're disclosing privacy, it has to look like this on the web page, and it has to be in this point font and this sort of thing. Because the reality is, you know, and you have to get consent with this kind of a checkbox, because the reality is in virtual reality, all of that doesn't work. And so what we need to do...
And also nobody reads it.
Well, right. And so I think the idea of saying, you have to communicate with people in a way that's contextual, the way that makes sense to people so that they understand how their information is being used, is an example of a principle. You also, the second thing that you have to do is you have to be willing to iterate. And I think, you know, we have to have principles that are established that reflect sort of our views on the way to do this, independent of technology and independent of specific use of data. But then we also need to recognize that we don't know what's everything right now. And so one of the explicit goals that we set out when we established sort of the way that we think about ethics within Facebook is to iterate it regularly and to recognize that what we've set out in 2015 is not going to be what's going to work in 2018, and that we need to continue to have that ongoing assessment process.
Still, Gary, and there's a great tool developed by the philosopher John Rawls for slightly other purposes called the veil of ignorance. And under the veil of ignorance, what you do is you project yourself into a future where you cannot know whether you are rich or poor, whether you are powerful or weak, whether you're a man or a woman or anything, and you say, if I didn't know any of those things, where it was just a roll of the dice, what principles would I develop for the application of the way the world ought to be considered? And that's the sort of thing which I think your question invites. You're right, we have no idea of what the technology might allow, reverse engineering back to us. So we've got to say, if such a world of ignorance, through the veil of ignorance, was one where every single aspect of our life could be known, it could be deployed, what would be the basic principles that we would apply now in order to manage that situation? And I think doing that, which I think was where Rob was heading, you can start to get a sense of what you would build that is technology neutral and effective in terms of dealing with our interests.
But implied in Stilgering's question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is also just the query about whether, given what, you know, the possibilities of what could be done with our data in 10, 15, 20 years' time, should there be, just as a core principle, some sort of, you know, expiration date built into the collection of this stuff and its use in some putative future?
Boy, I just think that's both challenging and limiting. And you know, kind of what we want to do is, in a perfect world, is reach this balance of that all benefits would be optimized to their full extent and all risks would be mitigated to their full extent.
Oh, you're asking such trust.
No, but well, no, but this is I get it.
I mean, look, I'd love to believe that was so. A little part of me is kind of thinking, yeah, maybe not.
Well, I think that, you know, kind of what Rob was saying, that we're trying to predict 5, 10 years from now, I think is kind of a zero-sum game. I don't think it's possible. But where I think we need to get is to this, you know, more describable objectives-based process or objectives-based framework, and not this totally, I mean, to be blunt about it, abandoning this tick box compliance mentality. Because that then at least gives us some flexibility to be adaptable. But I think we also have to be very comfortable that we're not designing something for a 10-year longevity. And this is not going to be perfect. They call it the enemy of the good is the perfect. But we need to kind of start to build, metaphorically, build the plane while we fly it is the, I think, the you know, the way, and not be uncomfortable that it isn't going to work at all times.
And maybe make it more possible for people to say, I've stuffed up.
Yeah.
Correct.
When people make mistakes.
But it also then, the way you speak, requires organisations, businesses, whatever, to keep reiterating, why am I here? Why, you know, this is why we are here. This is what we are here to do, rather than the tick the box compliance.
I mean, this gets, I suspect that there's many in this audience who saying, oh, this all sounds great, but my organization isn't going to fund this. And so, there has to be this quid pro quo type of thing. And I kind of think about it that investing in this sort of framework should create more ability, more confidence, more comfort for organizations to create value out of the data. Yeah. But you don't get the latter unless the former is in place.
Now, we had a question here, I think. Can I get that? Just here, put your hand up so we can see you. Yep, there we go. And then I'll come to you afterwards. And did we have another one while I'm looking at in the audience? No? Okay.
Suzanne Conley from the Victorian Tertiary Admissions Centre. A lot of data that's collected by the tertiary admission centres across Australia is mandated to go on to government, the various government departments for a variety of reasons. But recently I've been at, or 2 years in a row, I've been at conferences where that data has then been provided to another company who are now looking to use very detailed information about socioeconomic backgrounds, a whole range of things, to create platforms whereby young people can go in and plug in all their data and it will tell them the likelihood of their ability to continue at university. I mean,
these are private companies.
It's a private. I don't want to name it, but it's a private organisation.
Can I just ask, is the VTech Authority getting a lot of money for logging this data off? Or?
No, we are like many of us, we're mandated. We have to provide it to the government, who then provides it on.
They sell it on.
Well, I don't know if they sell it, but they provide it to another organisation.
That's my question. Yeah. Okay.
I really don't know if they sell it on. And now, the last 2 years, this group have been talking about creating programs which all of the educators in the room were mildly appalled at, where kids would type in and it would say to them, well, based on your socioeconomic background, your parents' history, etc., you won't do very well at university, that sort of thing. Or your odds of doing well at university.
Wrong postcode, yeah.
Okay.
But my question is, we talk about ethical stewardship with organisations and private companies, but is this being taken up by government?
We'll get one person to answer this, if we can. Yes, Simon. Not me.
Obviously not is the answer. I mean, you just told us, obviously not.
Yeah.
And I suspect that government, in this case, as in many, has acted without any thought about the ethical dimension at all. There would have been, somebody came up with a good idea, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Most things go wrong in ethics, not because people are wicked, but because when you ask them, why did you do it, it seemed, oh, everybody was doing it. That's just the way we used to do things around here. And this causes havoc in the world. So I reckon you've just given a perfect case study for why governments need to be as strenuously engaged in this as anyone else.
And this gets back to moral imagination. You can't tell me there wasn't someone in that room at some time, right, whose gut said to them when that decision was being made, you think?
But also,
one person.
But once that happens, are they saying, sorry, we misunderstood your purpose, no longer will you have access to it? Yeah. Have they actually reacted to this, or have they just said, oh no, well, it's too late?
I do want to get to my final question, so I'm sorry about that. And Peter, did you quickly want to jump in there?
No, I just want to extend this. We just have to kind of imagine that the world of thinking about data collected is going to be increasingly irrelevant. Decisions will be made about inferred and created data, not collected. And so without this sort of ethical decision-making, call it what you want, framework, we're just not going to have the ability both to realize the benefits but also kind of mitigate the harms.
Do you agree, Rob? Yeah. Go right ahead. Oh, sorry, we've got our very last question just here. Put your hand up, please, madam, so we can see you. There you go. And you've got to make your question really short.
Really short, because we all want to go for coffee.
That's the one.
Okay, I'm just thinking, we live in a global world. Most people are scared or speculate that, look at Russia, look at America. However much we agree the ethics, and let's assume that we all agree the ethics of what's the right thing to do with customers' information. Let's think beyond that globally. What about where the ethics are different in another country where it may be driven by poverty or greed to sell information? that we are doing everything in our power to protect?
You know what, we're going to table that question because it's going to be dealt with in a panel later on in the day when we get to international regulation. But will you please thank our terrific panellists today, won't you? Rob, Simon, and Peter.
Thank you.